I spent the last year working on a book called Hacking Your Education, which is about my own non-traditional educational background. And it tells my story and uses that as a narrative basis, but it also weaves together the stories of about 40 other people that I interviewed who've done interesting things with their lives without relying on formal education. Some got college degrees, some didn't, some never went. But the common thread is that what they do professionally has absolutely nothing to do with what they learned in the classroom. When I was in 5th grade, when I was 12, I came to my parents and said that I didn't want to go to school. Now, lots of 5th graders say that, but my parents actually took me seriously. And they said, you know, it's your life. You should make your own decisions. If you don't want to go to school, the worst thing that could possibly happen is that you might go back one day. My parents spent many sleepless nights wondering about whether or not I would be able to succeed outside of school, particularly given that my mother was a school teacher and my dad an engineer, both products of the system. But ultimately, they allowed me to become an unschooler, the self-directed form of homeschooler. So instead of going to middle school and high school, I found mentors, I built businesses, I did internships, I lived in France for half a year, I volunteered in my community, and I was able to do things that I never would have been able to do had I been inside a classroom. Unschooling is an educational philosophy that started back in the 1960s. Now, the term was coined by a guy named John Holt, who'd been a teacher in New York City for 20-some years. And he'd been asking the question that you normally ask when you go about improving something. And he'd been asking, how do we make school better? And he'd come up with all the traditional solutions of getting class sizes smaller and personalizing the education, and eventually came to the conclusion that that was not the right question. That the right question to ask was rather, what are the outcomes that we actually want from school? Do we want school to form a community? Do we want it to be a social equalizer? Do we want it to deliver knowledge? And if so, based on those outcomes, what is the best way to actually achieve those outcomes? Now, I go back to this because people like to talk a lot about education reform and changing the education system today, but I want to remind you all that education reform, particularly ideas about anti-institutional education, are not new. A.S. Neil started a school in the UK in the 1920s called Summerhill, and he wrote a book by the same name in 1960. And that book about the democratic free school that he started sold 3 million copies over the 13-year period from 1960 to 1973. Summerhill is a democratic free school. The teachers, there's no curriculum. The students hire the teachers. And it's student-centric in every possible way. John Holt started a magazine called Growing Without Schooling in the 1970s to push his ideas of unschooling out into the world. And what's interesting is that this magazine was actually delivered to your mailbox in a brown paper bag, as though its contents would be as objectionable to the postmaster or your neighbors as pornography. And that's how crazy and radical these ideas about alternative education were. The real question here is not about whether you should go to school or about whether you should leave school. It's about whether or not we trust people's innate capacity to be curious. And that's the real question. Do we think that people need to be put into a system to be guided and molded and tested and shaped, like kneaded like bags of flour? Or do we think that if left to your own devices, that you'll be able to ask questions, answer them, and come up with answers? One point that I want to stop on and clarify is that homeschooling is not the same thing as unschooling. My parents didn't pull me out of school because they didn't want to teach me evolution. That was not the case at all. Leaving school was my idea, and unschooling is something that's done for educational reasons. And another good thing to clarify is that unschooling, leaving a school, does not mean that I learned in a solitary way. I was not sitting in my room on my computer looking at lectures for 16 hours a day. So I had a really vibrant community of individuals who were around me who were able to support me in the process. So like I mentioned, I did things like work on political campaigns, I organized collaborative learning groups, I played in bands, I helped build a library in my hometown, I went to conferences, I worked in Silicon Valley at startups, and eventually, even after spending 6 years outside the system, I still went to college. And that's because it's what I thought the next step was. Even as an unschooler, I justified my choice to leave school by saying, hey, my friend Sarah was unschooled and she got into Harvard, so it must be okay for me too, right? My parents had gone, my peers were going, and that's what society expects you to do if you want to be an educated member of society, right? Yet I found that at college, the same frustrations that I had in my 5th grade classroom were still present. People were there not because they actually wanted to learn, because they knew it that they were curious about, but because they didn't know what else to do with their lives. And that's perfectly normal. I don't know what to do with my life. I'm 20, but most 20-year-olds don't either. But if you don't know what to do with your life, there are a lot cheaper ways to spend 4 years than in an institution of higher education. And one of the massive problems is that the cost of college is rising astronomically. In the US alone, the cost of college since 1980 has gone up more than 350%, more than any other real good in the economy, more than transportation, healthcare, medical costs. And this is quickly being followed by the cost of education in other countries. The UK tripled tuition fees last year. There are protests all across South America right now about the rising cost of college. And it's hard to imagine that other places won't soon have to raise university tuition fees to be sustainable. The average student in the US takes on $27,000 in debt upon graduation, which is just an astronomical number, and really forces you into one path if you want to be able to pay back your loans when you graduate. Student loan debt has now surpassed credit card debt, and it's more than $1 trillion, which is pretty scary and means that we might have a crisis on our hands that could be bigger than the housing bubble. But the problem is not just that the cost is rising, but the quality is declining at the same time. This is why the New York Times has been writing articles about Generation Limbo, the generation of college students who are under 25, who have college degrees, of whom 22.5% are unemployed, and another 22% are working in jobs that don't require their degree. They didn't expect to go to Yale and get an English degree just to work at Starbucks. There's been rampant grade inflation. 60 years ago, only 15% of grades that were given out were A's. Today, more than 40% are. And Academically Adrift, a study that was done at NYU last year, found that 36% of college students over the course of 4 years of college showed no improvement whatsoever on skills like critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. So the challenge is not just that the cost is going up, but the quality is plummeting as well. And my argument today is not that schools should go away, but rather that there should be ways for people to forge multiple paths. About a week before I left college, I was having dinner in the cafeteria, and a friend of mine was asking me serious questions about how I was going to support myself and what I was going to do when I left school. And finally he came to this question, which I found a little bit funny. Not because he thought that going to date girls and drink beer was the main purpose of college. That actually seems like one of the better reasons to go to college, in all honesty. But rather, he didn't understand that this is something that you can do outside the university. Like, you can get drunk and go on dates in the real world too, right? You don't have to pay $40,000 a year to do that. Just as in the same way that you don't have to pay $40,000 a year to learn. And when I finally got over being flabbergasted about this, I finally came up with a good comeback, which was that I prefer guys and champagne, and there was more of that in San Francisco than there ever was in Arkansas, where I was at college. So I started writing publicly about my frustrations at uncollege.org, and started this movement which has grown over the course of the past year. And now we provide resources and create real-world educational experiences for people who want to learn outside of universities. We provide academic camps, get people together from all over the world to learn about the skills of self-directed learning. And next year, we're also launching a gap year program to take an entire cohort of people through the entire year-long process of what not going to college might look like. But what we're doing is just a little small piece of the greater trend, which is that education is becoming decentralized. You used to go to school and get everything from it, your professors, your teachers, your classes, the network, the community. And now those things are slowly being taken apart. It used to be that you'd go to a lecture and get that knowledge, and now MIT has been putting their courses online for over 11 years. And more recently, we see things like Coursera and Udacity, but ultimately, that's pretty boring. The knowledge bit is easy to access. What's more interesting is alternative ways to find communities, looking at incubators like Y Combinator and seeing what communities arise there, or looking at things like Skillshare that are enabling people to create real-world classes, and how that's decentralizing parts of the university. The last and probably most difficult part of the university to decentralize is the signaling effect. College degrees effectively function as a form of currency, to show as a proxy to employers that you're competent and can accomplish something in the world. But already, if you want to become a programmer or a designer in Silicon Valley, you don't send in your resume or your transcript. You upload your portfolio to a website like GitHub or Stack Overflow or Behance and prove your knowledge through contributing to that community. And people can evaluate your work in real time. Education is changing more rapidly than we can possibly imagine. And I think when most people talk about changing the education system, they think about this in the wrong way. And the point that I want to drive home here is that, to me, it's not about changing the education system. It's about removing the education system. 20 years in the future, there won't be an education system because curating your education costs a fraction of the price of a college education and is orders of magnitude more meaningful. Thank you very much.